Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I know I'm still just watching some of the numbers as people are coming in, and so letting everyone get settled, but we're really excited to have you join us this evening. So let me start off. I will, first of all, just welcome all of you and thank you for being with us. We're incredibly excited to have you for the second of a three-part series on immigration and the 2020 election. And the third one we'll remind you at the end, but we'll be completing the series next week at the same time on Wednesday at 5:30. I'm talking about faith voices on immigration. But for now, we're going to get started with the program tonight, talking about Not Just the Wall. So let me start by introducing myself. My name is Rory Picker-Nice. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, and we are honored to be one of the co-sponsors of tonight's program, together with the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University, the Episcopal Church of the Holy Communion, the Episcopal Diocese of Missouri, Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis, and IFCLA, the St. Louis Interfaith Committee on Latin America. I'll give you a little bit of a glance of what we're going to be doing this evening. If we just go to the next slide. Great. So for the agenda tonight, we're going to be starting off. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing the slide. I don't know why it's getting blocked on my screen. But we're going to be starting off with an opening reflection, and then I will be passing the floor to some of my colleagues who will do the presentation and speak about barriers to immigration. We'll then have time for Q&A. So at any point during the program, you can put your questions into the chat, but we will have a more formal section for Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can use the Q&A feature or the chat, and then we will conclude with some reflection and a call to action. So let me just start us off by just grounding us a little bit from the Jewish tradition. As we look at our teachings, one of the teachings that just strikes me most of all as we talk about immigration is probably the most central story that we have in our tradition, the story of the Exodus from the land of Egypt, right? The beginning of the book of Exodus in the Bible. And what's so striking as within the story itself is that the story, as it opens in the book of Exodus, it says that a new Pharaoh arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, who then begins to start to create all of these terrible policies against these people that had been living in his land. And so first of all, it's incredibly striking because prior to this, we had all of these stories about the ways in which this man Joseph had saved the Egyptian people from hunger and starvation. And so on the one hand, it seems really odd to say, what does it mean that he did not know Joseph? Like, how is that even humanly possible? Because even if he was a new Pharaoh, even if he had not been the king before, it would be like saying that like there was an American who didn't know who Abraham Lincoln was, or right, there's certain people who are just part of your national history. How could it be that you wouldn't know this person who had done so much to help the people? And so the commentaries say he made himself as if he didn't know him. That what he did was he decided to harden his heart, to decide that he didn't know who this person was. And in doing that, what he was able to do was to basically say, not only that he didn't know this person, but to then say, there's this strange people living amongst us, and we need to worry because they might become too powerful for us. And if they become too powerful, they'll rise up against us. And to me, it's so resonant of the moment that we're living in today, of what does it mean to have to physically harden our heart, to have to ignore the history of immigration that has become such a huge part of our country's history, of my own family's history, right? How do we tell ourselves that the story that we know so well is actually a story that we don't know? And then in order to be able to tell ourselves that there is a foreign group that we have to fear, because that is what then ultimately seems to drive so much of our conversation. And that's a choice. That's a choice that we make if we want to harden ourselves and if we want to ignore our history, or if we're willing to remember the ways in which we have been strengthened and bettered because of the diversity that exists within our midst. So I'm so honored and deeply humbled to be joined by colleagues who can say that story so much better in the moment that we're in. And I'm going to pass the floor over to my colleague, to Sarah John, the Executive Director of the Interfaith Committee on Latin America.
Awesome, thank you. We're going to pause just a minute because, like the rest of us, I'm still learning about Zoom expertise. So I'm going to see if Alyssa can pull it up. I don't know where those black boxes came from. So let's see if this does any better. That looks great to me. Does anyone else think that's working for everyone? Rory, is that better on your end? Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight. Like Rory said, I am Sarah John. I'm at the Interfaith Committee on Latin America. We are an independent nonprofit organization that was founded not quite 40 years ago. And our work focuses on education, organizing, and accompaniment around issues of human rights and social justice in Latin America. And I'd like to introduce or invite my colleague Nicole to introduce herself as well.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Nicole Cortez. I'm one of the co-directors of the Migrant and Immigrant Community Action Project, or MICA Project for short. And we are a local nonprofit that works with immigrants to overcome barriers to justice. So we mostly, principally do that through provision of direct legal representation in immigration cases. And we're fortunate enough to work closely with others such as IFCLA and other area organizations on issues of advocacy and policy work as well.
So I think a couple things before we sort of dive in, maybe just give you a perspective of where we're going to go. I think first and foremost, it's important just to own that these types of presentations always fall short to me, right? There's never enough time to say all the things that I want to say. And I think that's okay, right? I think one of the goals is that you walk away tonight with some more questions, probably with some, hopefully with some greater confidence, and some clarity around some things that, or clarity around some things that maybe you already knew some about or maybe didn't know about, but then also maybe a little bit new information so that you can continue your journey in deepening your understanding of how, as people of faith and goodwill, we are called to live in this world, right? So we're going to go through some barriers, and we're going to talk about sort of following a journey of a migrant, if you will, and encounter and explain some of those things. So Alyssa, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. I want to start by talking about sort of the first barrier, right? And I think many of us talk about that barrier as the right to stay home, right? And why is that a barrier, right? Is because sometimes we, as the United States, have had a co-responsibility, have shared responsibility in denying families and individuals the right to stay home. So I want to share, sorry, Alyssa, I should have shared this with you. There's a video clip on the next slide. So the sound is sort of irrelevant in this one, but if it works, then great. It's just audio, just like music. So we have no audio on this one, which is totally fine, but we will probably have to stop sharing before we get to the next one. It's really just like powering and impactful music. So just imagine some exciting music. Awesome. Thank you. Alyssa, I'm going to go ahead and ask you if you wouldn't mind. Yep, great, doing those things. I think that the point here, right, we could spend several hours talking about U.S. intervention, and I think the point that I want to arrive at is that at some point, and I would argue that that point has long arrived, we have to accept responsibility, shared responsibility for outcomes that have happened and been caused not just by us, but also by us for decades, right? And US foreign policy and intervention in Latin America has laid the foundation for a lot of the migration trends that we see today. And specifically, I will argue, has directly resulted in the phenomenon of undocumented migration. So let's go ahead and try sharing one more time. And we can go to the next slide. And so I think the idea here is, so the next question is, what happens when you can't stay home? What do you do? And I think some people leave, right? Some people migrate. So I'd like to talk about the second barrier, which is getting to the US and what that barrier is like in and of itself. Next slide, and we have a video with some audio, please. Hopefully. The point here that I want to make, and we could make several points, right? But when we're talking about the barriers that in the specific circumstance, what's described in this film is generally focusing on Central American immigration to the United States. And for many of those people, many of whom the people that Nicole and I work with, those individuals have to cross multiple barriers, barriers of nation states, right? And I think the last point I want to make very quickly is that in something, when we think about intervention and we think about why this is happening this way and why it looks this way, that is not something that is just decades ago. It's not something that folks like me or generations after me learned about in school and it stopped in history. This is active and current and is currently maintained. So if we looked at something like the Mérida Initiative or Plan Frontera Sur, which are two programs, collaborative programs between the United States and Mexico, we could see billions of dollars appropriated under US Congress with supports of current and previous administrations that are funding Mexican immigration and Mexican government enforcement against these people. So this is a both and, right? So I think then, let's say, next slide, when you get to the next barrier, let's say you make it through all of that, then what?
And so I'll take over here for a minute. Thanks so much, Sarah, for laying that foundation on which we can talk about what happens. How can people, whether it's by choice or a forced choice, if you will, enter the United States? And so obviously there are ways to do that lawfully or legally, and ways to do that when those options don't exist. So next slide, Alyssa. This is going to be probably almost impossible to see unless you have incredible eyesight. And the point is not that we go through it, but just I do often share this infographic. Almost ridiculous, as you can see, per the drawings here on this infographic. This system is. But the takeaway that I'd like you to feel free to Google this. It's actually very interesting and informative. But from that slide, this one here with the cartoons, you have to pretty much have ties to the United States. So that can come in the form of a person, a family member, or in the form of an entity, a business. But basically someone needs to petition for you to come to the United States if you want to live there. And I think, again, the takeaway is there's not just I want to go live in the United States and I'd like to do it the right way. How do I do that form? There's no fee to pay to do that. Of course, tourist visas exist, but those only give people an opportunity to be in the United States, and only certain people the opportunity to be in the United States for a temporary amount of time. And so again, feel free to look this up. It's pretty interesting. Feel free to share it. I think it's a good illustration. But now, next slide, Alyssa. Thank you. This is sort of a more boiled down, a little more boring version, but they're sort of principal pathways to coming to the United States that include, as I mentioned, sort of the family-based immigration system where you have a tie to a US citizen or a green card holder, a lawful permanent resident, and the employment-based system where you have a tie to a US company. There is something called the diversity lottery, which we're not really going to spend a lot of time on because it basically is literally playing the immigration lottery. And there are very few of those available every year for countries that are underrepresented in the current US immigrant population. The main ones that we'll talk quite a bit about are humanitarian immigration and how that relates to, the asylum seeking system, asylum system and asylum seekers, and then the refugee system as closely related. And then, of course, those who either overstay a visa because they had temporary permission to be here or cross the border without permission in the first instance. So we can talk a lot about how these categories, even so, don't really give the whole picture. Often there are folks who are in a process, as they like to say, where they have a pending application. Those wait times for humanitarian type things or other family-based immigration, as we'll talk about, can be years. So there's a lot of limbo in immigration law and a lot of ways that folks can be between statuses or sort of in process to get a status or without status temporarily. Sometimes they can be work authorized, but not permanently authorized. And I am sorry if my internet I might have gotten a message that it's good. Okay, I apologize for that. Hopefully we're better now. Sarah, is there anything you think I should repeat?
No, it was good. There's
okay.
been just a couple quick flips, so I'm
okay.
on the standby if we lose it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, let me know if I need to repeat anything, and sorry again about that. But yes, so that's sort of the big overview of the legal immigration system. I did want to touch, as I mentioned, and we can go to the next slide, on family-based immigration. So again, we talk about sort of what's the right way, how can you do it the right way, what line can you get in? And as I said on that first sort of cartoony slide, there really isn't a line for lots of people, but people who are lucky enough to have a line to get in because they have a US citizen parent, for example, who may be naturalized after they were born and after the individual applying for status was born in a foreign country. And if you're lucky enough to get in a line because of that type of family membership, this handy dandy little visa bulletin illustrates sort of the reality of those lines and the amount of time that folks who today in October of 2020 are receiving their what are called immigrant visas, but that essentially is a green card, when they applied. So as you can see, for example, if we look at the column of Mexico, folks who are siblings, that's that F4 category, folks who are siblings of US citizens, you might have applied for your sister in June of 1998, and here we are in 2020, and now your sister can immigrate to the United States and live permanently as a permanent resident. So I would propose that feels a little bit unworkable. The system is designed such that each of these categories gets a certain number of visas per year, and that no country can have more than a certain percentage. And so that's why you see China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines broken out, because they are what are called over-solicited. So they are capped at a certain percentage of the overall total. There is a lot of information, as Sarah's saying. This is meant to just sort of give you a taste, wet your whistle, if you will. If we can go to the next slide, Alyssa, I just wanted to do sort of an illustration of what that means today. So as I mentioned, somebody in 1998 applied for their sibling. As an immigration attorney, and as those who know people that in 2020 might be considering what they could do for legal options, we can talk about Martia. So let's pretend that there's a lovely young woman named Martia who's 21. She hasn't married yet. She's the daughter of a legal permanent resident, and that person, let's say it's her dad, he wants to petition for her. As I mentioned, they get 26,000 of that category, 26,000 and some visas per year in that category. So non-married adult children of permanent residents, and each country can get 7%. So that means that around 1,800 people a year from Mexico in that category can immigrate to the United States. So if we calculate for Martia, we say to, Martia's dad comes into my office and says, I'd like to apply for my daughter. She lives in Mexico. This is all assuming that she's never been to the United States. We can do a calculation for him. and illustrate, and you can keep clicking through here. Thanks so much, Alyssa. Illustrate what that would look like and arrive to the total of 78 years of wait time for Mardia to be able to come legally to the United States. So again, I'll renew my submission that this isn't a workable system. Mardia shouldn't have to be separated from her father for 78 years. Her father, I would suppose, is unlikely to be alive in 78 years. And it's just not a system that can work. So these laws are laws that are set, and they are statutory laws. So they are in sort of the Immigration and Nationality Act and set by Congress. And so Congress is able, so when we talk about immigration reform or changing immigration laws, this is something that could be changed by Congress and by the legislative process. So we can move on.
So like, again, so like here we are moving through. So like you can't stay home. You make it through one place. You can't stay there. You can't get into any of these very ornate pathways. Then what do you do, right? What does it look like to pursue building the kind of life and home for yourself and your family, right? And for many folks, that means finding another way to this circumstances that would let you build that kind of life for your family. And for some, that means migrating without authorization, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about the US-Mexico border. If you can go to the next slide. I think for some of you, I would love to be able to dive into this deeper. Some of you I know have heard me talk about this before. And this is part of sort of was really central to a lot of the work that I did as a master's student in Arizona. But there's a ton of really key themes that I think we see not just in border policy, but also in interior enforcement and really throughout immigration law in the United States. I think specifically about the border, I want to highlight 4 things. One is the progressive limitation of opportunities for legal entry, right? And Nicole just went through that pretty clearly, right? So if you fall into one of those really thin categories, then the system probably works kind of well for you, unless you're in one of those like categories that's in a perpetual wait cycle. But we continue to reduce the opportunities to do things, quote, the right way, right? The second thing is that since the early 90s, we have really built a policy to hyper-militarize the border region. And I could speak ad nauseum about this, but I think there are a couple of things here. One thing to notice is that, again, as Nicole mentioned, these are decisions that come from Congress. So while they're sort of, there's the foot on both sides, right? There's the administrative branch, which is where CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, and formerly INS and now DHS, all of that is administrative, and so that is influenced by who's in control of the executive branch. And I think there's also a space here where we talk about Congress again, right? Those of you who've seen me know that I'm not shy for calling out Congress for things that they need to do better, right? And I think one of the things that they've done here is continue to fund something that is profitable, and that furthers a narrative that is beneficial to the United States, and also funnels the kind of people that we actually want to have in this country. So I think what you see then, if you want to go to the next slide, is that since the early 90s, the series of policies that we created is building what's called prevention through deterrence. And so you saw it with blockade and gatekeeper. And so the idea was, let's make the border so hard and so not appealing that people will just decide not to cross, right? So what we did was close down sort of urban areas, cities along the border, shut those down. You see the walls, you see the tech, right? That has really blossomed in the last, 5 to 10 years, the amount of smart technology things that we do at the border. Also see contracts, right? So that also means contracting to private companies who are motivated by what? Profit, who then fill the border with the technology to maintain these sort of ideologies. The idea then, or the impact, one of the primary impacts, has not been net decrease in the number of people crossing the border or a net decrease in the number of unlawfully present folks in the United States. What it has been is an exponential increase in the rates of death and disappearance among undocumented migrants. And so I think we again, man, I would love to just talk to you all about this for the next 12 hours. But in light of this, let's think about how one way that we've seen, or a couple ways, in fact, that we've seen prevention through deterrence still the guiding policy of how we operate and maintain our border.
And so, as Sarah mentioned, you know, so much of this oppressive system is codified in statutory law, right? It's a structure that we work within, but there is absolutely an incredible amount of discretion delegated to the executive branch through those laws. And so Sarah mentioned, you know, policies that have been around for decades, and in the last 4 years, we have seen so many attacks and so many restrictions and so much hardening, as Sarah said, of our border, especially our southern border, but others as well. And so this is just, you know, as many of you have seen in the news for the last 4 years, you know, we started off within 2 weeks of the inauguration in early 2017 with the Muslim ban, or with the, you know, the travel ban from certain countries. And then shortly thereafter, in the summer of 2018, the implementation of the zero tolerance policy, which resulted in family separation. There was some incredibly tragic reporting today about children who now 2.5 years later are still separated from their families because of those policies. The Family Detention Center, and I'm no apologist and not going to give anybody a pass for terrible policy, but family detention started in the last administration under President Obama. And the use of family detention to detain especially women and children who are seeking asylum has only ramped up under this administration, and of course has exacerbated sort of the issue of the lack of access to the system for asylum seekers in our country. And so I'd like to, if we go to the next slide, the next slide might just be a photo, just of another example of Central American women and their children who come to our country, and this is sort of the conditions that they are met with as they knock at our doors, seeking protection from persecution in their home countries. So on the next slide, I wanted to touch a little bit on the asylum, attacks on asylum as it relates to our southern border. And so previous to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were multiple ways in which the administration had tried to sort of cut off the flow of asylum seekers. As some of you may have heard, there have been several large groups of migrants that have organized amongst themselves to come to the United States in groups. You may have heard the word caravan or other things throughout the past couple years. And in response to sort of the continued flow of asylum seekers from especially Central American countries, but honestly from across the globe, who, because of the system that we've already discussed, have no other option than to present themselves in person at our southern border. The administration took some pretty severe measures to address that. And so I do actually want to step myself back like 2 or 3 steps to talk about sort of what is asylum and why does this even happen. The United States, as many countries across the globe, are part of many international agreements and treaties that lay out this country's views on human rights and on this planet's responsibility to each other to account for folks who are the victim of persecution at the hands of their government. And so the United States has stated through its involvement in these treaties that we will process the claims of people who are present in our country and state that they have a fear of return. We have agreed to not return anyone to a place where they will be persecuted on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So there are several reasons. This is sort of the basis of our refugee system, and that's sort of a conversation for another day. But refugees are processed in their home countries or in a third country, and then brought to the United States. Asylum seekers are subject to a lot of those same considerations, but their claims are considered once they are on US soil or close to it. We can actually go back. I'm just talking a lot on that other slide. But I wanted to sort of lay the groundwork for asylum. And so, as I mentioned, we have always received asylum seekers on our southern border. There has always been a process for addressing their claim. We have something called a credible fear interview process, in which they are, present sort of, this is what's happening with me, and that's sort of the first hurdle they have to get over before they are allowed to see an immigration judge. And most often, the most sensical way for that to happen has been to allow them to enter the United States once they get over that first hurdle, reunite with family, or arrive with some sort of someone who can open the doors of their home in St. Louis or in Columbus, Ohio, or in New York City, or wherever it may be, such that they can then go to immigration court and present their claim to a judge. And this administration decided that that wasn't a workable plan, that they wanted to take lots of different measures to change the way that worked. And so we'll talk about the people who actually do get through and what they have faced. But the huge program that has affected thousands, if not tens of thousands of lives on the US-Mexico border is something called the Migrant Protection Protocol. So that's, I would say, a misnomer. It doesn't protect anyone, but it requires asylum seekers to sort of as a tangential policy. They implemented something called metering. And so you see these folks here, this is in Tijuana, and at the San Diego border, and they are required to sort of appear at the border, arrive to the border. The immigration officials say, no, I'm sorry, you'll have to take a number. So it's basically like waiting at a pharmacy or something, where you have to take a number. And pre-pandemic, I think folks were waiting anywhere from 2 to 4 months before their number was called. So they are forced to live in border cities like Tijuana, Matamoros, Ciudad Juarez, and figure out how to survive until they can have an opportunity to talk about their fear. And so that had already, again, pre-pandemic, affected tens of thousands of migrant families. They were then, under the MPP program, required to return to Mexico to await their court dates. And so folks, again, were waiting 6 months, 8 months, sometimes a year in border cities, and traveling back and forth, only at being able to enter the United States for a court date. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, all of the courts across the nation, including MPP court, were closed and canceled, and maybe forever. And so that's the reality of basically that the United States government has shut down our asylum system, and that was happening again even before the COVID-19 pandemic. There is no process by which our country is addressing its international obligations as it comes to asylum, as it relates to asylum, and doing any of the things it's responsible to do for folks when they arrive at our southern border. So I think we can move on now.
Thank you. So I think to sort of, as you can see, we're sort of arriving closer to, St. Louis. And I think the next question here is like, then what? Let's say you overcome all of these barriers in a multitude of ways, and then you're living here in St. Louis, in the interior of the country. The barrier that I want to talk about here is detention and enforcement. And so in this conversation, I want to think about like, what do our values call us to build in the kind of community that we're called to build? So how do we, if you use the frame of dignity, or if you use the frame of human rights, like what does that look like given all of these sorts of complications we've just gone through? What does that look like now? All right. So if you could go to the next slide, I want to lay out a couple sort of how this works, right? We've all, I think by this point, heard of ICE. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's the largest police enforcement entity of the U.S. government, and has a budget larger than all other enforcement agencies combined. And ICE, as some of you probably know, came about in 2001 after U.S. Patriot Act, after the attack on the World Towers and on the Twin Towers, World Trade Center, and the sort of reconfiguration of U.S. government that happened with the Patriot Act. ICE is responsible for carrying out enforcement, enforcing immigration laws in the interior of the country. They sometimes overlap with Customs and Border Patrol, or Customs Border Protection, which we all call Border Patrol, which happens in like a 60-kilometer radius of the border, which would also include ports of entry. So at times you would see, if you've ever traveled out of the country and arrived back to your first airport, which rarely for me is St. Louis, so let's maybe say Chicago or New York, the agents that you would go through there who stamp your passport are customs agents, right? Not to be confused with TSA, so I'm not trying to fall down that rabbit hole, but you'll see, right, that those agents happen in both places. The other thing I want to talk about, so we have ICE as a big player there. We also have contractors and private prison companies, which I definitely want to talk about. We'll get into that in a minute. And then sort of the third piece is state and county jails, but also state governments who are working to control and enforce, or shape really, what immigration looks like and how immigrants are welcomed or not in the interior of the country. So if you can go to the next slide, I want to just go over a few things, sort of ways that I have seen and that we encounter on a daily basis, the strategies that are used in order to identify and let's be honest, eliminate certain people from our communities. This conversation is not separate from one about mass incarceration, right? The ways that we can line this up with mass incarceration of communities of color, and specifically men, but not exclusively. A lot of that knowledge, a lot of that parallel analysis also happens here, right? And I want to go into, I want to talk about sort of the local police to ICE pipeline and some of these, how local police are involved in identifying immigrants, trying to ascertain status, trying to get them out of the country. And then I want to finish up with one of the big programs that IFCLA is working against in collaboration with MICA Project. I want to, if you could go to the next slide, I want to kind of just do some surface level stuff here. When we talk about ICE, one of the things that we talk about is ICE picks people up and puts them in jail in order to deport them, right? In order to theoretically get them out of the country. One thing that some of us may not know is that Congress mandated a certain number of people that should be in detention at any given moment, sort of as a measure of effectiveness of ICE, right? This came about in 2013 and has only continued to sort of explode in expenses and in cost and in money and in space and in people, right, that are behind that. So what this means is that Congress says, well, if ICE is doing a good job, then they should have X number of people detained at any given moment. And so then that sort of cycles into ICE asks for a certain amount of budget, right? And so they say, well, if you want us to detain 54,000 people a day, then I need to have a space for them to detain. The fact, one of the pieces here is that about 75% of immigrants who are currently in detention are detained in private prisons, right? And so that opens a whole nother pathway of conversation about motivations behind private prisons, profit, how all of that works, and the explosion of subcontractors in the private prison industry. The next slide, I kind of want to just touch on, yes, sorry. There's so many things I want to say. So one fancy alphabet soup is IGSA. This is an intergovernmental service agreement. This is how federal government makes contracts with local governments, localities, usually sheriffs, sometimes municipalities, and says, we need you to reserve some bed space for us. So rather than, for example, ICE creating a billion ICE detention centers that are owned and operated by ICE, they contract someone else to do that. And in Missouri, these numbers are from 2018. Data has been difficult / impossible to come by in the last 2 years. So this is a little bit outdated, but to the best of our knowledge, are still current, although the numbers in dollars might be slightly different. So ICE has contracts with 6 county jails in Missouri and 1 across the river in Illinois, which is the largest. And so we are constantly looking at where people are and how they are. This is also why you haven't seen us sort of like stage big protests at an ICE detention facility, because there isn't one in Missouri. They're subcontracted out. I think one quick point here is that this is really problematic when immigration detention is intermingled with like local criminal jail, because the line between local police and immigration agents is blurred. ICE agents regularly enter jails, and then the local jails are profiting from the business of deportation. And so even in places like, man, if you haven't been out to Montgomery County, Missouri in a while, they are struggling, and people there are struggling to make ends meet. And so having an influx of money and jobs and infrastructure in that community gets us into a pretty damaging cycle about how we're supposed to love our neighbors when some of us are profiting and able to put food on the table for my own family because of this increased enforcement. And then next slide, the last thing I want to mention here briefly is ISAP, the Intensive Supervision Appearance Program. I know several of you are on the call who are volunteers at IFCLA through this program. And what you're seeing is a picture of an ankle monitor. Many of you would that we could be in an open conference room and we'd be having this more conversationally, but how many of you have seen this, and what sort of image, or what's your knee-jerk reaction to an image like this is person is a criminal, and this person is probably on house arrest, right? And the government's, they've done something wrong. In the sort of counter argument to that is that actually in immigration, in the immigration section, people who are seeking asylum, who have made it through that maze at the border, who have been admitted into this country so that they can see an immigration judge and ask for asylum in St. Louis, are overwhelmingly voluntold into this program where they are placed on a 24/7 GPS ankle monitor device. They have monthly check-ins at a subcontractor at BI Incorporated. If you know where Upper Limits Rock Climbing Gym is in downtown St. Louis, sort of by the Wheel and Maggie O'Brien's, that's where their office is. And they have home visits sometimes once a month, sometimes once every 6 weeks. And this is sort of unchecked and indefinite, especially now. So we used to have teams that were going with upwards of 80 people a month to these check-ins, where there are also questions, where their attorney's not allowed to be there, where there are multiple layers of challenges that I would like to talk about that we don't have time for. That program is paused, which in some ways, like, great. I'm glad people don't have to go into these offices in times of COVID. The challenge with that is also that now there is no opportunity for hundreds, maybe thousands of people in St. Louis or in the St. Louis ICE office region to request to have these monitors removed, to transition to some sort of less type of surveillance. And that feels really problematic. And so we're still in a space of waiting to see like what's going to happen next. But I think many of us think, why is this even happening? Why are folks even on these monitors when the motivation is to show up to court so that they can ask an immigration judge for the protection of asylum? We can go to next slide, Nicole.
Yes, and so I know we are coming up to the end of our time, so I'll try to keep these last few slides brief because we really would be happy to take questions if time allows. But I think another thing, we've talked about family separation, we've talked about all these sort of interior policies, and I think one of the major things that has really devastated our immigrant communities is that under this administration, really, the use of discretion by immigration agents, which was limited at best, was sort of obliterated. So again, immediately sort of upon taking office, President Trump did away with what was called the priorities memo. The Obama administration had established certain priorities for deportation or priorities for enforcement. And the Trump administration was quick to say, no, let's just do anyone and everyone. Anyone and everyone who is here unlawfully, no matter their ties, no matter their equities, let's go ahead and deport them. And in that, of course, you know, across this nation, there are many different cities and many different sort of subcultures within the United States. And so there is a lot of variance between the way local ICE offices operate, the way, you know, grant rates for asylum cases across the United States by immigration judges. I mean, there are courts where only 1% of people who come before a judge to present an asylum claim get granted asylum, and other courts that are closer to 85 or 90%. And that's not because the strong cases are all moving to San Francisco and the weak cases are all moving to Atlanta. There is just a lot. And so this administration has certainly exacerbated that problem. If we could go to the next slide. Although I'm sure we could make a long list. Sarah, did you want to say something about this one before we start?
Nope, you froze. Keep going.
Oh, thank you. Am I better now? Yes? Okay. Sorry about that. As many of you know, we have to find places in our house where we can be left alone. So I'm trying my best to be both not choppy internet and not interrupted by children. And so the barrier to finding welcome. And so I think that we've talked about all these barriers, right? And on top of immigration enforcement and, you know, language access, if we haven't even talked about healthcare, racism, all of these things, there are that, you know, it continues to be once you're here, once you're part of our community, what does that look like? And so next slide, I sincerely hope that many of you are familiar with the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that was implemented by the Obama administration and a use of their executive power in 2012. And that program came under attack in 2017 as the Trump administration sort of ramped up. And so there has been, again, we could do a whole hour presentation just on DACA and what has happened, but these incredible young people here on this slide, along with almost 800,000 others in the United States, are sort of continuing to live in a legal limbo. So they were offered some temporary protection by the program. The Trump administration attacked that. The Supreme Court said the Trump administration did their attack in the wrong way, and now USCIS is sort of spinning its wheels and saying they won't do, USCIS being the one of the immigration agencies, they sort of won't do what they're told, and the Trump administration would like to try to end the program again. So as we know, a lot will become hopefully a little more clear after the election, but that is sort of the quick version of what is happening with the DACA program. And on the next slide, Sarah, did you want to do this one?
I think maybe we will have to just save this later and we could talk about it in questions if it comes up. But as many of you know, Nicole and I work together to support Alex Garcia. Shout out to Carly. Happy birthday. Thanks for being with us on your birthday evening, you goofball. But Alex has been living in sanctuary in Christ Church, United Church of Christ in Maplewood. And this is another way that communities of faith across the country and certainly locally here in St. Louis, many of you who are on the call, who are seeing all of this mess of things, trying to figure out, yes, and my values call me to do what? And how do I react and how do I respond? And one of the ways some people have found to do that is through sanctuary, right? How do we find dignity in the midst of a system that says you're not welcome? And to be clear, it is not to suggest that that individuals like me and you are not trying desperately and offering beautiful gestures of compassion and hospitality and welcome. And I think we just have a more nuanced and complex community than sometimes I would like to admit, right? So I think, you know, the point here is that we're trying to arrive at at that question, and certainly as we look at the elections coming up, but also the day after and the day after and all the days to come, how are we called to act in the midst of these realities? What are our moral obligations, and what kind of community will we continue to build? And so I think we can sort of end on that and move into questions. So we can it's maybe easier to, or unnecessary to have that slide, so we could take that down. I'm just going to pull up a couple questions here. I know we only have like 2 or 3 minutes. Are we still, Rory or Alyssa, are we still good to do a couple minutes of questions?
Let's do 1 or 2 questions and then we can start wrapping.
Great. Nicole, do you want to address about how asylum seekers from Europe and Asia are vetted, or what are the differences between, as you know, we focused the conversation on Central America. So do you want to offer
absolutely. So as I mentioned, and I just sort of glossed over it, but so I've spent some time in Tijuana on the border, and was able to work with asylum seekers. And I think that one of the most surprising things about being there is that actually, as you're at a port of entry, you know, and seeing dozens and dozens of asylum seeking families arrive at the wee hours of the morning to try to present themselves at the border is sort of the global diversity that's present. Certainly there are in greater numbers from the Central American countries and some South American countries, but I personally have seen, you know, folks from all over the globe. They are not, they are subject to the same metering, so the sort of like take a number, but they are not required to participate in the MPP program. That is specially reserved for those who speak Spanish. So those from Central America are unfortunately subject to that really cruel program. But in regards to metering and waiting in border cities for a more temporary amount of time, the same exact system is applied no matter where folks are from, and many, many do arrive from all across the globe.
Awesome. And I think that last question is sort of who pays for maintaining people when they cannot proceed to the next step in this whole journey, right? How do we talk about food and cleanliness and hygiene and sleeping quarters and basic sort of like humanitarian care? And I think my sort of short answer to that would be, in some ways governments are coming up with programs to sort of meet the needs of people who are in their territory regardless of their status. And in a lot of ways, I would say in most ways that I've seen, they're nonprofits, there are churches, there are congregations, there are communities that organize to accompany, to witness, and to sort of reclaim the humanity and the value that each of us have as sort of like global siblings, if you will. I think one of the most beautiful ways, awfully beautiful ways that I've seen that is in southern Mexico. There are several communities where the women gather to make food and prepare food in bags, and as the trains pass, the beasts that we saw, women and their families throw the food up to the migrants who are traveling and wish them safe passage in where they are. So I think these are sort of short-term and immediate responses, and the question that is before us now are like, what are the pieces that we need to do both in short term and in the long run? So, thank you.
Thank you both so much. That has been an incredible amount of information, and I hope it inspires all of our viewers to educate yourself. If there was anything that was confusing or anything that you thought, wait, what, I don't understand this, that's a really good opportunity to do some research. And there is a lot of information out there that's available. So as we wrap up, my name is Alyssa Banford. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement at the JCRC of St. Louis. And I'd like to read something very quickly. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands, you storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That, to me, is the embodiment of America. Our country was founded as a refuge for those who were experiencing persecution. This country has been refuge for so many. And if we start to close our hearts and our borders now, it's not very American. So I encourage you, as we move forward and you think, what can I do about this? It's a huge mess. What can I do? First of all, show up and vote. That's the first step. Second step, keep showing up. Because this isn't one thing that can be fixed by just electing anyone. This goes way beyond that. As Sarah and Nicole said, it's our Congress members, it's our judges, it's our security enforcement. The system is huge. And so that means that you need to continue to stay informed. It means show up. There are so many organizations here in the region that could use your help, IFGLA being one of them, MICA being another, maybe the International Institute. There are lots of ways to get involved, but I encourage you all to take those steps and get involved. So as we wrap up tonight, I would like to really encourage all of you to join us next week as we talk about our faith traditions and how they encourage us to care about immigration. It will be an incredible presentation, and we're very much looking forward to being with you all another night. So that's next Wednesday, the 28th, again at 5:30. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching.